Um, right, that's wonderful. So, as you all know, I'm really, really excited for our guest today. I learned about our guest from actually my daughter, who listened to her on a podcast, which I, of course, listened to, and she speaks to my heart. She will speak to all of your hearts as well, because she's a former Division I volleyball player, which my oldest daughter, who's had multiple concussions, had as well. And I was just in awe of her conversation on podcasts I listened to about the torture. And I'm going to be really honest about what athletes go through. And because a lot of us think, oh, athletes have all the money, right? They can take care of themselves. And that's so far from the truth. But, she has some incredible experience that put her into this position that she got very sick and then she had to get herself very well. And so she turned her whole entire health profile around through food. And it's so important to all of us to make sure that we eat well and healthy. So with no further ado, Ashley, your name is Kelly Jolly. Okay, Kelly Jolly. No further ado, I'm going to introduce Kelly Scott. She's a personal and executive chef in Los Angeles, and I'm going to do a share screen and go ahead and take it away.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to chat about kind of cooking for our brain health and how we can help our inflammation and symptoms through food and nutrition and cooking better for ourselves. So it's been a huge journey and helpful in my experience with traumatic brain injuries and my symptoms. Food has been a huge component in helping me with my symptoms and regulation and all of that. We can go to the next slide.
Okay.
So we're gonna basically be talking about the food-brain connection and how that works together, because we all know, like in the health world or just in general, that food impacts our health. They usually talk about diet, nutrition when it comes to weight loss or heart health, but they don't have a huge emphasis on how it actually impacts our brain, which there's a huge connection. And we're kind of going to go over neuroinflammatory diets, inflammatory foods, anti-inflammatory foods, what we should be eating and shouldn't be eating to help our brain health, triggers that may affect us personally versus other people may not affect, and then kind of go over reading food labels and seeing those triggers and cooking for our brain in general. So what is anti-inflammatory diet? Basically, this neuroinflammatory diet is a diet approach that aims to reduce inflammation in our brains, which means our symptoms are going to be much less than they were, and it will help basically anything that triggers us. So this is basically through food that is whole foods, nutrient dense foods, and anti-inflammatory in general, which we're definitely gonna go over what those are. Basically, the main goal is to decrease the inflammation, and this can be from anything from concussions, neurological diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, CTE. A lot of what we eat can help and impact these symptoms that we have, which I first got into it by reading Grain Brain. I found this book randomly when I was first diving into trying to help my symptoms personally when I was struggling with traumatic brain injury. And this book was super interesting and an easy read if you're interested in kind of the scientific breakdown of how ingredients affect our brain health. It discusses wheat, carbs, sugar, and other inflammatory foods, and basically the negative effects on your brain. And it actually shows a ton of studies of how these directly affect diseases like Alzheimer's, dementia, ADHD, anxiety. So that definitely opens the door into the world of nutrition and brain health. And it's a really good read if you're ever interested in something like that. But then we're also going to discuss the gut-brain connection. So what this refers to is basically the communication from our stomachs and our food and what we eat to our brain. So they're always communicating. They're communicating through things like our vagus nerve, which is like the main nerve that runs down our whole body and communicates to our whole body. It also communicates through neurotransmitters. So these are things like serotonin, dopamine, The chemicals that make us happy and bring us joy, a lot of that's produced in our gut, actually. Even though we think it's in our brain, like 94% of serotonin is actually produced in our gut. So a lot of the things we eat will impact that. And then we're also, the communication is between gut microbiome, good bacteria, bad bacteria, which is affected by what we eat, and then also our immune system. So immune system is so big when it comes to inflammation and brain inflammation, and a lot of that's produced and controlled by what we eat and our gut health. So all of that is to say that everything we eat, everything that happens in our stomach and gut is also having a huge effect on our brain. So it's really important to know what we should be eating, maybe what we shouldn't be eating, and our triggers. So some of the main inflammatory foods that can affect our brain health, especially, these are the main groups. And there's obviously more, and there's obviously some that you won't have effects on yourself. It's just more finding what affects you. So the main ones, gluten is very huge, especially in the US, how we process our gluten and how we treat our gluten, which is basically the protein of wheat. So things in like bread and cereals, oats even have a gluten in it. So how we process that in the US has a huge effect on our health because it causes a lot of inflammation. It can lead to things like, personally for me, I know I get a ton of brain fog when I have gluten. That was a huge trigger I discovered when I first was on my health journey. Tons and tons of brain fog. So it definitely can lead to inflammation, especially again, how it's produced in the US is not fantastic. And then we have things like refined carbohydrates and sugars. These are kind of common sense. We know that candy, sweets, cookies isn't great for us. Again, this spikes blood pressure or blood sugar, which leads to inflammation, especially in the brain as well. And then we have processed food, packaged goods. This is also a little bit more understandable. These have tons of additives and chemicals, especially in the US. There's not a ton of regulation in these. So knowing your ingredients and reading labels on packaged goods, these are things like cookies, canned soups, crackers. Things are kind of in like the middle aisles, have a ton of additives, which could be inflammatory for our brains. Now we have hydrogenated oils and vegetable oils. These are not necessarily amazing for inflammation and brain health because they're very high in omega-6 fatty acids, which these cause a lot of inflammation. When we're looking at the fatty acids, it's usually they talk about omega-3s or omega-6s. Omega-3s bring down inflammation, omega-6s spike. So these are oils like vegetable oil, canola oil, soybeans, soy. So anything like that, I always say it's not great to have in the house. I won't cook with them personally. Obviously, it's harder to avoid in restaurants, but if you have them in the house, it'll definitely help decrease some inflammation from those. And then the final three ones, alcohol. This is a general whole body inflammation in general. It's quite literally a poison to our body. So there's a reason we get horrible migraines during hangovers. It's great to just avoid that in general or limit consumption, obviously. And then processed meats. These are things like hot dogs, items like deli meats. A lot of those have chemicals that are additives to help preserve them, which also can cause inflammation and issues in our bodies in general. And then lastly, pesticides and herbicides. This is a huge problem in the US because there's not a ton of regulation on this. These are things that will be sprayed on crops and agriculture, like fruits and vegetables, to help prevent bugs and weeds. But this also means it gets into our produce and then we consume that, and that can lead to a ton of inflammation. So just knowing these could be potential triggers. I know that's a lot. We're also going to go over like swaps and what triggers are, and maybe discovering what works for you and what doesn't work for you. But these are definitely the most inflammatory foods in general. And then we have anti-inflammatory foods. So these are foods that basically counteract inflammation in our bodies and are in direct opposition to the foods we just discussed. So the main one, whole foods such as fruits, vegetables, meats. These are obviously great for you. There's no processing on whole foods and vegetables. So if you cook them for yourself, it's often really anti-inflammatory. Some really good anti-inflammatory foods are berries like blueberries, raspberries, anything rich in color, and then dark leafy greens too have tons of anti-inflammatory properties. Then we have like complex carbs and sugars. These are in direct opposition to the refined sugars that we just talked about. These are more complex carbs are ones that are higher in fiber. They don't spike your blood pressure or blood sugar, sorry. So they don't have the inflammatory properties. So these are items like sweet potatoes, quinoa, beans, starchy squash, and then whole fruit as well. They're always going to be better than other simple sugars like breads and sugar. Another anti-inflammatory food are omega-3 rich oils. So kind of like the opposite of the omega-6 ones we just talked about. Omega-3 oils are ones that are higher omega-3, which again are anti-inflammatory. This can be found in items like fish oil. So a lot of people will take fish oil supplements. Those are great for anti-inflammatory in the brain. And then oils like olive oil and avocado oil. I love cooking with these personally. These are the only ones I will have in my kitchen, along with like ghee and coconut oil, which are really good for the brain because they're much richer in omega-3s than omega-6s. And then we have organic produce and meats. Again, organic is a little bit more helpful in the US because there are less harmful pesticides and herbicides used. So knowing what produce this might be good for, there's such things called the dirty dozen, which I like to personally have for for organic produce because they have less of the dangerous pesticides and herbicides, which you can easily Google a list of what those dirty dozen are and buy organic of that. And then same with meats, this helps too, since a lot of meats in the US are given hormones or chemicals to help preserve them, and organic helps with that as well. And then lastly, I like these ingredients just for anti-inflammatory properties. Turmeric and ginger are fantastic, whether you use them as spices or in teas. And then also dark chocolate, so anything above 70% is a nice little sweet treat without all the added inflammation. So now that we've discussed kind of the anti-inflammatory food, inflammatory food, there are tons of foods out there that are good and bad for you, but it's all about knowing your triggers. So what a trigger is an ingredient or food group that can initiate or worsen symptoms. So this can be neurological symptoms. For me, I get tons of brain fog when I eat certain food groups, or my brain is just slower post concussions when I have these food groups because of inflammation. So it's kind of just discovering what triggers affect your symptoms the most. And this can best be done through things like elimination diet, which is where you take out these big inflammatory food groups for a certain period of time. Usually it's a month. And then you slowly reintroduce one at a time. And then if a trigger pops up, you know that this food group is what is triggering your issue. So for me, for example, gluten, a massive one for me. I will get horrible brain fog for multiple days if I eat gluten. Also, oils are a big one for me too, I discovered, whereas some other inflammatory foods aren't as symptomatic for me. So it's definitely very personalized, which once you go through elimination diet or even working with a professional to discover this, it's a lot more manageable and less intimidating than seeing all those huge food groups and having to eliminate all of them, because that can be kind of a huge task on a day-to-day basis. And then now we're just kind of going to do a few slides of a little game of like this or that of what we think is the inflammatory food versus what isn't and what we would rather eat. So here we have two peanut butters. One is Skippy, one's a Trader Joe's peanut butter. And below we have the ingredients listed for both. The peanut butter, the Skippy one, it is peanuts, sugar, hydrogenated vegetable oil, whereas Trader Joe's is peanuts and sea salt. So like, which do we think would be more inflammatory?
Trader Joe's.
It's going to be the Skippy. And that's mostly because of the two ingredients that are inflammatory that we discussed: sugar, pure sugar, and then we have the hydrogenated vegetable oil, which vegetable oil is huge in omega-6s. So making that healthier swap to maybe a Trader Joe's or another
Yeah.
peanut butter that doesn't have these ingredients could help with inflammation.
Okay.
And then our next one, we have Oreos versus this is a Simple Mills cookie. So you can read all of the ingredients in the Oreos versus the other cookie. And which do we think is going to be more inflammatory that we probably should avoid?
Oreos.
For sure, the Oreos.
Oreos.
Oreos have
Mhm.
obviously the wheat flour in general. Gluten could be problematic. And then the canola oil, corn syrup, which is even worse than normal sugar, super inflammatory. And also a good rule of thumb, if there's like a bunch of things you can't really pronounce in ingredients, that might not be the best because it's usually chemicals or additives that isn't really normal to food, which these Oreos definitely have a ton of, whereas the other cookies, the Oreo knockoff, is just nuts, seeds, coconut sugar, which is a more whole form of sugar, and more whole ingredients versus like corn syrup and oils and stuff like that.
I think it's a little deceiving if somebody is not well versed in this. And Kelly, I'm asking you the question, not really stating it, but you see the words vitamin B2, right? And vitamin B1. And so you naturally think, oh, this must be a better Oreo, right? And so for the normal consumer who isn't necessarily well versed in this, there is some misleading labeling that goes on for sure.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's a great point because yeah, again, like a lot of these quote unquote vitamins or even folic acid in their whole form in whole foods, like from carrots, you find lots of vitamins in. They're great. But if you're adding it in, it's not a natural vitamin. It's usually synthetic. It is processed in labs and chemicals. So it's not like it's giving you any benefits. They're not actually giving you vitamins per se. It's more for the flavors, and it's actually not even good for you since it's all chemically made.
Okay.
And then the last this or that, we have this is a grass-fed butter. We have butter on the left, and then on the right we have, I can't believe this is not butter. So which one do we think here would be more inflammatory?
I can't believe it's not butter.
Because it's not.
Yeah, I put this one
That's
here
true.
too. Put this one here too, because like a lot of people and in the health or in the just American general think butter is like horrible for you, whereas a lot of butter alternatives like can't believe it's not butter has actually a lot more inflammatory properties, like the oils, a lot of the added vitamins and unnatural flavors. Whereas whole butter, especially if you buy like high quality, better ingredient, organic grass-fed butter, it'll be a lot less inflammatory than these alternatives. So there's always going to be healthy swaps that we can find. And then, so what's the best way to decrease these inflammatory foods in our diet? For one, making the healthy swaps. So if you're having a packaged product that you know is inflammatory to you, nowadays there's almost always a healthy swap. I would say like a decade or 2 decades ago, not as much, especially gluten-free or alternative oils and stuff like that. But nowadays there's almost always an item that you can be swapped and be just as good, and the ingredients are not inflammatory for our brains and tastes amazing still. So finding those healthy swaps is a great way to start. Another way is just shopping the outer aisles of the grocery store is fantastic because you're going to find more of those whole foods like fruits, vegetables, meats, yogurt, stuff like that, that are less processed versus the middle aisles. If it's in the middle and it's not refrigerated, for example, they usually have more preservatives and chemicals that are keeping them in those middle aisles and not needing to be put under refrigeration. So it's good to shop the outer aisles and find those fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, meats, and stuff like that, which leads to also cooking for yourself as another amazing way to lead a more pro neuroinflammation or anti-inflammation diet, because if you cook for yourself, you know the ingredients and what goes into it. You can control what triggers are there versus not there for you versus eating out or eating just processed food a lot of the time. And a great way to dive into cooking and cooking for yourself is how I got into cooking is through nutrition and just learning the basics. So in culinary school, for example, we don't learn recipes per se, we learn the techniques and the science behind it. So I always love learning the why behind things. So if you learn these, I always say these 6 basic techniques: roasting, braising, stewing, sauteing, grilling, and frying. It seems intimidating at first, but once you learn the science behind it, like what items should be grilled versus sauteed, what items should be roasted versus braised, it's a lot easier to cook for yourself and also more enjoyable because you know the science behind it and how to do it. And I have tons of resources, free resources on my website and social media of like teaching the basics of how to do these things. And I also have a ton of this in my cookbook as well that goes along with instructional video, kind of step by step videos with recipes and each technique. So it makes cooking for yourself a lot more manageable. Because I mean, I remember when I first started cooking, I would look at a recipe and it would say like saute this chicken, and I didn't know how to do that. So knowing kind of the fundamentals, and you will be able to have a lot more fun in the kitchen, have a lot more fun cooking healthier anti-inflammatory foods for yourself that can help your brain health and just health in general for the most part.
All right. And then here is Kelly's plug. So we have 10 minutes before Zoom is going to kick us out because they're getting strict on their limitations as well. And so I'm going to kick off, and please everybody unmute yourself, jump in, or type something in the chat. Kelly, I think I'm a cook. Look at cooking as one big experiment, and I had a bunch of food allergies, and so I had to learn to cook too. And so can you maybe go over the styles? Like, I would sit here and I would probably fail this if you were going to say, here's this kind of meat, Lynn, let's say a steak. Tell me all the ways that I can cook a steak. And I'd be like, well, I know I can grill it, but I don't grill, right? And so I know I can pan fry, but then I worry that there's going to have to be too much oil and butter, and maybe I'll broil it, right? And so I always guess, and I do approach cooking like a chemistry class, and my children can attest to sometimes it was really, really, really bad, and sometimes it was really, really good. So can you kind of just give a little bit more of examples on how you figure that part out?
Yeah, for sure. A steak is a great example of you pick the item of food that you have on hand and then figuring out the best like properties for that. So meat, for example, if you have a lean meat, faster cooking techniques are better for that. So we have a few of the slow cooking techniques here and fast. The slow ones are more braising, stewing, whereas the fast ones can be saute, grill, pan fry. So a good rule of thumb, if it's like leaner in meat, it's going to need faster cooking time because you don't need to break down the fats in there. Whereas if it is higher in fat, for example, it's better to do the slow and low cooking process to kind of break down those properties. So I always start with what I have in the fridge and then kind of go from there of what property or what the best outcome technique would be for that item. So just knowing, and this is the same for vegetables, potatoes, all of that. Each cooking item has the best technique and methods to pair with it, and just pairing it with that method.
Okay. A question that came in was, is there a difference in olive oils?
Yep.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are differences in olive oils. We have a few different kinds. There's extra virgin olive oil, which is the one that is kind of processed the least. It comes from like the first press of the olives. This is good for lower smoke point cooking, so lower temperature cooking, because when an oil has a low smoke point, that means it can't be cooked at high temperatures because it will burn. So like extra virgin, really high quality oil, but I wouldn't cook with it at a high temperature. Whereas they have the next oil underneath it, just like olive oil or virgin olive oil, has a little bit higher smoke point. Not as many health properties, but you can cook with it at a higher temperature. And then you have the very, very base oil, which is just like labeled olive oil. It's not virgin oil. This is usually processed and pressed a few more times than the extra virgin, and can also withhold or could be cooked at a much higher temperature too. So there are different olive oils, different purposes, and cook at different temperatures with too.
The question that came in is, where can I connect with Kelly? So here is her info. I'm gonna type in her, do you want your email, Kelly, also?
Yeah, I put my email in there.
Okay.
Everything's at Kelly's Clean Kitchen at Gmail. But yeah, you can find me on my website. Any social media is at Kelly's Clean Kitchen. I answer Instagram DMs a lot, so that's an easy way to ask me a question. I'll usually get to those within a day or a few days too, and then email as well.
Okay, and all that'll be in the follow-up. One thing that you mentioned was about the spices and the sauces, right? Because I remember hearing this before. You can have, so you go and you get a chicken and you roast your chicken, and it's like, oh my God, I'm gonna have chicken again tonight. You're on night number 3. And I remember you saying you can really change it up and make a whole new meal with the same chicken by your sauces. So can you kind of
Mhm.
give everybody a little bit of a hint about that and how you might incorporate some spices with it?
Absolutely. Sauces in general is a great way to make your food more exciting. I'm like a big fan of using sauces and also different spices. So spices are things like cumin, paprika, you have dried spices, you also have herbs, which are a form of spice. So you have cilantro, parsley, green onions, you have ginger, garlic. So you have the dry, which are just the dehydrated form of this, and then also the fresh too, which you can incorporate into a quick sauce. You can incorporate into a sauce that you'll have in your fridge for a few weeks. But spices and sauces are a fantastic way of just making meals more exciting. And they're easy too because you can just have them in your refrigerator. You can either buy them. There's a ton of like great sauces out there on the market that are also healthy, or you can make them and have them for a week and add them to different proteins and mix and match them, which is what I usually do for my quote unquote meal prep. I like to just make a bunch of plain proteins per se and then mix and match the sauces that go with it. And spices is a great way to flavor up your sauces. Like we talked about the ginger and turmeric as anti-inflammatory spices. Those are fantastic to put in sauces as well.
A question came in, what's your favorite way to use turmeric?
That's a great question. Again, in sauces, but I also love um, pairing spices and especially turmeric with the flavor profiles that they're most often used for. So, like, turmeric's great with Asian cuisines and especially Indian and like Pakistani cuisine. So, I will use them in curries or curry vegetables, curry soups, curry sauces like that because they pair very nicely and naturally with where they originate from and where they're usually grown.
Chili spice mix. Do you have any hints for a good chili spice mix?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of like great chili spices you can buy already out there that are already made, which is easy. If you want to personally make your own, it's really fun to buy whole chilies. You can buy whole dehydrated chilies, which you can buy mostly at Mexican supermarkets or on Amazon even too. You can buy whole dehydrated and actually have fun mixing and matching, pulsing them in either a spice grinder or a blender into a fine paste to make your own mixes, which is fun if you like more spicy ones. You can pick spicier chilies, or if you like more mild ones, you can do that too. But you can definitely do that by having your own dehydrated chili pods. You buy them and then basically just grind them up in a spice grinder. Or again, you can find a ton of great chili mixes on the in supermarkets as well.
Okay. And does your book include INR diet suggestions?
It doesn't list any, but everything in my book is anti-inflammatory. So I personally only really cook anti-inflammatory. So you will not find any inflammatory foods in there. I always recommend organic meats and produce, and I have actually a section where I talk about ingredients and the importance of that and sourcing. I always list anti-inflammatory oils. There's no gluten in my book, so you're really not going to find any inflammatory foods in my book in general. So technically everything is pro anti-neuroinflammatory diet.
Okay, there's one more question. Now, everybody, I gotta make sure Kelly has a shameless plug. She's gonna give everybody a discount code for her book. In the hard book, the hardcover, she has an electronic book, and this will go in the email as well. She had sent it to me. In the hardcover book, not in the electronic book, she has a QR code. And correct me if I'm wrong, Kelly, you actually show how to do the foods that you're cooking with the QR code. Is that correct?
Yes, so it's a link that you can type in the actual web address link that is listed in the book, and it takes you to basically the library of videos that goes along with the book in general. So everything that we talk about in the book, there's going to be a video component with it too that kind of explains the cooking process. So there is knife skills videos, there is roasting, sauteing, grilling videos, there is everything, every single recipe video on there is too. So if you're like a visual person and want to see how a technique is done, you will find that through the link that's listed in the book. And also if you buy the ebook as well, that is directly linked too. So there's a whole video library you get access to go along with the book.